I didn't buy this land, I didn't fence it off. I didn't even know it existed until I found out an entire neighborhood had quietly built their lives on it and decided it wasn't mine anymore. Not a few feet, not a corner. Over 1,000 acres, treated like community property by an HOA that acted like I was the trespasser. They sent letters before I ever stepped foot there. They fined me for rules I never agreed to. They spoke with the confidence of people who had never been challenged and didn't expect to be. But the deeper I looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated gamble that no one would ever push back. The moment I did, everything changed. Meetings turned hostile, threats got quieter but sharper, and that's when I realized this wasn't about land anymore. It was about control. So the question is, what happens when an HOA finally picks a fight with the one person who actually owns everything they're standing on? Before any letters showed up or boundaries were questioned, life was quiet in the way only rural land can be quiet. The kind of quiet where days blend together, where the land itself feels steady and unchanging. I wasn't looking to shake anything up. I had inherited the property unexpectedly, the result of a distant relative's passing and a will I hadn't thought much about until a lawyer called. Overnight, I went from having no plans at all to suddenly being responsible for more land than I'd ever walked in one stretch. The property sat just outside a fast-growing suburban area, a place that had once been open fields and grazing land but had slowly been swallowed by development. On paper, it was a single massive parcel. In reality, it was a patchwork of woods, trails, old fencing, and paved roads that no longer made much sense. Parts of it looked untouched for decades. Other sections looked lived in, maintained, almost curated. At the time, I assumed that was normal. Land changes hands, neighbors overlap, and things get messy at the edges. I didn't move onto the land right away. There was no rush. I visited occasionally, walking sections of it on weekends, taking photos, making notes about erosion, trees, and access points. It felt more like stewardship than ownership, something long-term and slow. I wasn't thinking about profit or development. I wasn't thinking about enforcement or control. Mostly, I was thinking about responsibility, about not breaking whatever quiet balance already existed there. That balance, as it turned out, was carefully managed by people I hadn't met yet. Beyond one tree line sat a large residential community, neatly kept lawns, identical mailboxes, a shared entrance sign polished to a shine, the kind of place where rules weren't just followed, they were expected. It had an HOA, though at the time I barely registered that fact. They seemed self-contained, like a world with clear edges. I had no reason to think those edges crossed onto my land. At first, the overlap was subtle. A walking trail that continued farther than expected, a maintenance road that cut through my property instead of stopping at the boundary, a small sign posted where I knew none had existed before. None of it felt aggressive. It felt assumed, like someone had made a decision years ago and everyone else had simply gone along with it. I didn't confront anyone, I didn't call a meeting. I told myself there would be records, easements, some explanation buried in county files. Things like this didn't happen by accident, but they also didn't usually happen without paperwork, so I stayed patient. I gathered documents, I reviewed surveys, I asked quiet questions. That was when the first letter arrived. It wasn't rude, it wasn't threatening, it was confident. It referenced community standards, shared responsibilities, and expectations for property upkeep. It spoke as if we were already in agreement, as if I were already part of something I had never joined. Reading it, I felt a strange disconnect. The land I thought I had inherited and the land they described didn't feel like the same place. And that's when the unease set in. Not fear, not anger, just the growing sense that I had stepped into a story that had been unfolding long before I ever showed up. I hadn't done anything yet, but somehow the conflict had already begun. What followed that first letter wasn't a sudden explosion, it was a steady tightening, the kind that doesn't feel dangerous at first because each step seems small, almost reasonable on its own. Another letter arrived a week later, then another. Each one referenced rules I had never seen, obligations I had never accepted, and violations tied to land I hadn't touched, trail maintenance, unauthorized access points, community use areas that apparently required upkeep on my part. The language was polished and calm, but the message underneath was unmistakable. They believed the land already belonged to them in practice, if not on paper. I started mapping everything. Old surveys against new satellite images, county records against what existed on the ground. The deeper I looked, the more unsettling the picture became. Roads cut through my property that were not public. Utility lines that served the neighborhood crossed land no easement covered. Recreational spaces, benches, signage, even small structures sat squarely inside my boundaries. This wasn't accidental drift over decades. This was deliberate expansion, slowly normalized until no one questioned it anymore. And the HOA knew exactly how much ground they'd taken. The fines began soon after, not massive at first, just enough to feel insulting. Penalties for failure to maintain shared green space, warnings about liability risks due to uneven trails, notices that my land posed a safety concern to residents using it daily. Each fine carried a deadline, each deadline carried a threat of escalation. Liens were mentioned casually as if they were a routine administrative step. It was clear this wasn't about compliance, it was about pressure. I pushed back the only way I could at first: documentation. I sent copies of the deed, survey lines, county acknowledgements. I expected confusion, maybe even embarrassment. Instead, the response grew colder. The HOA stopped acknowledging ownership questions altogether. They pivoted. The issue, they claimed, was no longer who owned the land, but who was responsible for it. According to them, responsibility had already been established through years of community use. Well, they treated time itself as consent. That's when the harassment became more personal. Contractors hired by the HOA began showing up unannounced, performing maintenance on my land as if it were routine. When I asked county officials about it, I was told it was a civil matter. When I contacted the HOA's management company, I received templated replies that addressed nothing. My name appeared in internal community newsletters as an absent owner. Online forums lit up with speculation. Some residents framed me as a threat to their lifestyle. Others implied I was waiting for the right moment to sell everything out from under them. What made it worse was how coordinated it all felt. The rules were enforced selectively, always in ways that boxed me in. If I tried to restrict access, I was warned about interfering with established pathways. If I allowed access, I was fined for not maintaining it to HOA standards. Every move I made created another violation. It was a maze designed so the exit only existed for people who already belong. I began receiving notices about special assessments. Apparently, the community had voted on improvements to shared spaces that fell entirely within my property: paving projects, landscaping upgrades, drainage systems. I was expected to contribute financially to projects I hadn't approved on land I legally owned for the benefit of people who treated me like an obstacle. Refusing to pay meant penalties. Paying meant acknowledging their authority. The pressure wasn't just financial, it was psychological. Letters arrived more frequently. Certified mail, legal language sharpened. References to past court cases I'd never heard of cited as precedent. They framed everything as inevitable, as if resistance was naive. It felt like being buried slowly, one sheet of paper at a time. The assumption was clear: I would get tired, I would compromise, I would sell. Instead, I dug deeper. I learned that the HOA had been operating in this gray area for years. Previous owners of my land had been distant, disengaged, or financially constrained. None had challenged the encroachment. Over time, the HOA filled the silence with certainty. They documented their own use. They treated inaction as approval. And now they were betting that the pattern would hold. That bet extended beyond paperwork. Survey markers disappeared. New ones appeared in slightly shifted locations. Temporary signage became permanent. I found out secondhand that residents were being told the land dispute was almost resolved, that I was being unreasonable, that lawyers were already involved and the outcome was a formality. None of it was true, but truth didn't seem to matter as much as repetition. When I finally attended a public county meeting to clarify zoning and access, I realized how deep the narrative ran. HOA representatives spoke confidently about the land as if they had standing. They referenced community needs, historical use, and long-term planning. I wasn't mentioned directly, but I didn't need to be. The implication was that I was a technicality, an inconvenience. The most unsettling moment came when I received a notice warning me against hostile actions toward residents. No explanation, no incident cited, just a preemptive framing of me as a potential aggressor. It was a subtle move, but a powerful one. It shifted the tone from dispute to defense, from paperwork to reputation. At that point, I understood something important. This wasn't about resolving a misunderstanding. This was about forcing an outcome before I could stop it. The HOA wasn't reacting, they were advancing. Every week that passed without decisive action strengthened their claim in practice, if not in law. They were counting on momentum, on confusion, on the weight of an entire community pressing in one direction. And then came the notice that changed everything. Buried in a routine-looking envelope was a reference to a pending vote, one that would authorize the HOA to pursue formal remedies against non-compliant landholders. No names listed, no details provided, just a date, a timeline, and a clear signal that the next step wouldn't be letters or fines. It would be something far harder to undo. Standing on that land again, looking out over roads I hadn't built and trails I hadn't approved, I realized the fight was no longer theoretical. Whatever move came next would define who actually had power here, and whether ownership still meant anything at all. And the HOA had no idea how far I was willing to go to prove it. The moment the HOA made its move, it did so with confidence bordering on arrogance. Notices went out across the neighborhood announcing a formal enforcement action against unresolved land violations. It was framed as routine governance, the kind of administrative cleanup that happens when someone refuses to cooperate. To them, this was the final squeeze. Enough pressure, enough noise, and I would either fold or disappear. Instead, I showed up. What they didn't know, what none of them had bothered to confirm, was that I hadn't been preparing for compromise. I had been preparing for exposure. Months of quiet work came together at once. Updated surveys stamped by the county. Historical aerial images showing exactly when roads, trails, and structures had appeared. Records proving there were no easements, no permissions, no agreements hiding in some forgotten file. Every assumption they had leaned on collapsed the moment it was placed under light. The confrontation wasn't dramatic in the way movies portray it. There were no raised voices, no grand speeches. That made it worse for them. The facts were presented calmly, methodically, in a public forum they had chosen themselves. The HOA's representatives spoke first, repeating familiar claims about community use and shared responsibility. They expected agreement, or at least confusion. What followed was silence. One document after another dismantled their narrative. The land they claimed had never left private ownership. The community assets they maintained were unapproved encroachments. The fines they issued had no legal foundation. Even the vote authorizing enforcement was revealed to be procedurally flawed, passed without proper jurisdiction. Their authority ended at a line on a map they had crossed years ago. The shift in the room was immediate. Residents who had only heard one version of the story began to realize how much had been assumed on their behalf. The confidence drained from the HOA's posture. Questions replaced statements. Clarifications replaced accusations. For the first time since this began, they weren't controlling the narrative, they were reacting to it. The legal turning point came quietly but decisively. A county official confirmed what the documents already showed. The HOA had no standing over the disputed land. None. Every action taken beyond their boundary was unauthorized. Every fine issued was unenforceable. And worse, their long-term use did not strengthen their claim, it weakened it. The longer they had acted without permission, the greater their liability became. That realization hit them all at once. What had been framed as a defensive measure suddenly looked like a years-long overreach. Contractors working without consent, funds spent on land they didn't own, residents encouraged to use property they had no right to access. It wasn't just embarrassing. It was dangerous for them. The HOA's representatives tried to regain footing, suggesting negotiations, shared solutions, mutual benefit. But the tone had changed. The authority they relied on was gone. In its place was something they hadn't anticipated: accountability. They weren't facing an absent owner anymore. They were facing consequences. The most telling moment wasn't spoken at all. It came when the enforcement notice, the one meant to scare me into compliance, was formally withdrawn. No announcement, no apology. Just a quiet retraction entered into record, stripping their threat of power in front of the very community they had rallied behind it. Standing there, it became clear this wasn't just my victory. It was the collapse of a system that had relied on silence and assumption to function. The HOA hadn't lost because they were challenged loudly. They lost because they were challenged correctly. But the story didn't end with that meeting. Because winning on paper is one thing. Undoing years of entitlement, expectation, and misuse is another. And as the reality set in, a far bigger question loomed, one the HOA could no longer avoid. What happens next, now that they've been exposed? And everything they built rests on land that was never theirs to begin with. The fallout didn't come all at once. It unfolded slowly in stages as reality replaced assumption. After the enforcement notice was withdrawn, the HOA went quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar. No more letters, no more fines, no more confident language about shared responsibility or community standards. Silence settled in where pressure used to be, and that silence spoke volume. The first real change appeared on the land itself. Maintenance crews stopped showing up. Signs were taken down. Informal paths began to fade as residents realized access was no longer guaranteed. What had once been treated as communal space gradually revealed itself for what it had always been: private property used without permission for years. The shift wasn't dramatic, but it was undeniable. Boundaries, once blurred by convenience, became visible again. Behind the scenes, consequences mounted. The HOA had to answer uncomfortable questions from its own members. Where had dues gone? Why were funds spent maintaining land the association didn't own? Why were residents encouraged to use spaces that now carried potential liability? Meetings that once focused on landscaping and minor violations turned tense and defensive. Trust eroded. Leadership positions changed hands. Committees dissolved and reformed. The illusion of quiet control cracked under scrutiny. For me, the resolution was both practical and personal. I didn't rush to punish or provoke. I did what should have happened from the start. I formalized everything. Survey lines were clearly marked. Access points were closed or renegotiated under proper agreements. Where cooperation made sense, it was handled legally and transparently. Where it didn't, the answer was simply no. Ownership, once treated as symbolic, became real again. The legal clarity changed the tone of every interaction. Conversations shifted from demands to requests, from entitlement to caution. People who had once spoken on behalf of the HOA now spoke carefully, aware that assumptions carried consequences. The power dynamic reversed not because I sought control, but because the rules finally applied to everyone equally. What stayed with me most wasn't the victory, it was the lesson. HOAs at their worst don't always rely on force. They rely on momentum, on the idea that if something has been done long enough, it must be allowed, on the belief that individuals won't challenge institutions, especially when those institutions speak with collective confidence. But that confidence is fragile. It depends on no one asking the wrong questions. This dispute was never just about land. It was about how easily authority can grow unchecked when silence fills the gaps, how quickly rules become weapons when they're enforced without accountability, and how dangerous it is to assume that ownership, rights, or boundaries will protect themselves without being actively defended. In the end, the HOA didn't collapse, it adjusted. It became smaller in influence, more cautious in action. And the community learned something it hadn't before, that power doesn't come from how many people agree with you, but from whether you're actually right. Standing on that land now, with clear lines and quiet restored, I think about how close it came to being lost, not through force but through neglect, through the simple assumption that someone else knew better. So the real question isn't whether HOAs have too much power, it's how often that power goes unchallenged, and what disappears while everyone assumes it's already gone.